In July of 1925, trial attorney Clarence Darrow and statesman William Jennings Bryant met in a Tennessee courtroom to debate the origin of man. Then it was evolution on trial against the publicly taught and sanctioned scientific creation theory. The jury's verdict in the Scopes trial was far from final as the debate rages on today. Just when you thought the debates were over for 4 years, think again. Here's one you won't want to miss. Tonight, live from Kansas City Youth-For-Christ Auditorium, a special 90-minute presentation of KC Online, Creation versus Evolution. If you thought you had all the answers, think again. Stay tuned.
KC Online. I have a question to the last gentleman.
Hello, KC Online. Yes, I'd like to have a question for your first guest. I'd like to know why.
Welcome to KC Online, the live call-in program that addresses the issues and problems facing our community. And now, here's your host, Tom Calvert.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of KC Online, one we've looked forward to for a long time. Throughout this century, man's quest for knowledge has been unsurpassed. The discoveries are incredible, the revelations awesome. Despite all the scientific accomplishments, however, there's still much controversy in science about the origin of man. The biblical account of creation, the accepted account of man's origin in most arenas until the early part of this century, has been moved to the back burner. In its place, the theory of evolution is taught in most educational settings to the total exclusion of scientific creationism. This has created a mood in academia and among many scientists that says religion is the enemy of science. On the other extreme, many in the church have taken to the attitude, science is the enemy of Christianity. Neither attitude is correct, in my eyes, neither acceptable. I believe, like many, in the inerrancy of Scripture and believe the Genesis account of creation to be correct. I also, however, believe many in the faith are ignorant of what they believe and why they believe it. My position on creation obviously does not make me totally objective as a moderator of such a debate tonight. But let me emphasize, I will not be debating, I will only be moderating. As you will see, my role is minimal in this evening's debate. The importance of my role is to see each debater is given fair treatment under the rules of the debate. To this, I promise both sides fairness. You, the viewers, are the judges of the winners and the losers. But as far as I'm concerned, we will all be winners from this open exchange. Now let me introduce tonight's distinguished scientists. First, on the right of the stage, Dr. Duane T. Gish from the Institute for Creation Research in Santa, California. Dr. Gish received his PhD in biochemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. He spent much of his career with Upjohn Company as a researcher and has been the Associate Director and Vice President for the Institute for Creation Research since 1971. He's the author of 4 books on scientific creationism and numerous publications, and listed in Who's Who in the West and in American Men of Science. Please welcome Dr. Duane T. Gish. Dr. Gish. Next, representing the evolution position is Dr. Paul L. Hilpman, from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Dr. Hilpman received his PhD from Kansas University in geology and mining. He is a professor of geology and director of underground studies at UMKC. He is a frequent lecturer on a wide range of topics, not the least being evolution as a process in natural systems. Dr. Hilpman acts as a consultant to industry, government, and the private sector and belongs to numerous professional organizations. Please welcome Dr. Paul L. Hilpman. Dr. Hilpman. Now to the ground rules for this evening's debate. Each of the gentlemen will make a 15-minute position statement. The debaters will then each be given 5 minutes for rebuttal. Then the gentlemen will each be given one more rebuttal period of 5 minutes. This sound will be indicated at the time that their period is up. We'll then finish out the evening debate with the audience participation part of the program. Questions will be fielded at the microphones in each of the 2 middle aisles of the auditorium from the studio audience. Tonight, unlike other nights of this program, KC Online, we will not be taking questions from by telephone. Due to the constraints of television and the importance of not being interrupting our debaters' points, let's take a quick 2-minute break and return with our special creation versus evolution debate tonight on KC Online. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our special KC Online 90-minute debate, Evolution versus Creation, with Dr. Duane Gish from the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, California, and Dr. Paul Hilpman from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. It was previously agreed upon by the two debaters that Dr. Gish would state the creation position first, so if there are no questions, Dr. Gish, you may begin. You have 15 minutes, and if you'll start the clock.
Thank you very much, Tom. Certainly it's a pleasure for me to be here in Kansas City. My wife was born here in Kansas City, graduated from Wyandotte High School, so we're always glad to come here to Kansas City. Of course, I'm especially pleased to have this opportunity to present the scientific case for creation. Now let me dispel, first of all, the notion that perhaps this is a debate merely between science on one hand and religion on the other. For neither creation nor evolution is a scientific theory. Obviously, there were no human witnesses to the origin of life. There were no human witnesses to the origin of the universe. There were no human witnesses to the origin of a single living organism. These events happened only once, and they happened in the unobservable past. You cannot construct testable scientific theories about history. So evolution is no more scientific than creation, and it is certainly just as religious. It involves a person's world view. Now, there is circumstantial evidence available. We want to look at that circumstantial evidence here this evening. And I am absolutely convinced that that circumstantial evidence is powerful, positive evidence for creation. Now, many people assume that evolution is a proven theory, and the only question is the mechanism. Well, there seems to be some doubts even in the minds of some evolutionists. Dr. Michael Denton has 2 earned doctorates from British universities. He's not a Christian, not a professing creationist. But in 1985, he published a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. On the flap of that book, we read the following: "The theory of evolution as propounded by Darwin and elaborated into accepted fact, quote unquote, by biologists is in serious trouble. This sober, authoritative, and responsible book by practicing scientists presents an accurate account of the rapidly accumulating evidence which threatens to destroy almost every cherished tenet of Darwinian evolution." Unquote. This scientist, as I emphasize, neither a Christian nor a professing creationist, and he just has published a devastating critique of evolution theory. On every count, according to Dr. Denton, evolution strikes out. His analysis is objective. He has no bias towards the creationist point of view. If anything, he has a bias towards the evolutionist point of view. And then I want to quote from a book by Dr. Soren Lovetrop, a Swedish scientist, concerning the mechanism of evolution. I heard Dr. Lovetrop speak a number of years ago in Jerusalem at Hebrew University. He and I had been invited to address what they call the first annual conference on origins and evolution. They had invited both evolution scientists and creation scientists. When I heard Dr. Lovetrop speak, I knew immediately, first of all, he was an evolutionist. Secondly, he was not a Darwinian. He did not believe the Darwinian mechanism or the modern Darwinian mechanism that is being taught in the universities throughout the United States as established fact. He did not believe that that mechanism was correct at all. He did not believe that mutations and natural selection had anything to do with evolution. He was more or less an advocate of what we call the hopeful monster mechanism. He believed, for example, that a reptile laid an egg perhaps and a bird was hatched from the egg, that you just went immediately from a reptile to a bird. Well, of course, not many people believe that, but he tended to believe that. But he published this book called Darwinism, The Refutation of a Myth. That was in 1987. What he calls the Darwinian myth is the modern theory of evolution taught in our university today as established fact. Listen to what this famous Swedish scientist had to say, a man who is an evolutionist. On page 422 of that book, he says this: "I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. Just think of that. See what he said. This Darwinian myth, he says, someday will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. That is being taught as fact in our universities and colleges throughout the United States today. He says is the greatest deceit in the history of science. We go one step beyond that. We say not only is this modern Darwinian theory the greatest deceit in the history of science, but the very notion of evolution is the greatest deceit in the history of science. Not that evolutionists are deliberately deceitful. No, they have been deceived, or they have deceived themselves into believing something that is totally wrong. Well, what about the evidence? Well, I want to take a look at some of that evidence tonight in this very brief time. Let's take a look, first of all, at the historical record. That is, from the fossil record. Now, according to evolutionists, life began as a little microscopic organism, they say several billion years ago. And that little microscopic organism, through a series of genetic mistakes that we call mutations, has transformed itself into all the things that live today, including people with our 30 trillion cells in our bodies, 12 billion brain cells with 120 trillion connections, that all came from a little microscopic organism through a series of genetic mistakes. Now, if that has happened through hundreds of millions of years of time, that would produce an enormous number of intermediate stages. As fins of a fish became feet and legs of an amphibian, as the forelimbs of a reptile changed and wings of a bird, scales changed into feathers, apes evolved into people, and so forth. This would have produced billions times billions of transitional forms. Our museums today have 250,000 different fossil species represented by hundreds of millions of fossils. The Smithsonian Institution Natural History Museum alone has 40 million fossils. If evolution is true, tens of thousands of those fossil species should be of intermediate or transitional forms. On the other hand, of course, if creation is true, each kind would appear fully formed, without any ancestors, without any transitional form. Well, let's see what the fossil record reveals. In rocks called Cambrian rocks, which evolutionists believe began to form 600 million years ago. In those rocks we find a vast array of very complex invertebrates, snails and brachiopods and clams and sponges and jellyfish and worms, sea urchins, sea cucumbers and things like that. Billions times billions of those fossils are available in the rocks around the earth. Preceding those rocks, evolutionists believe the Precambrian rocks were laid down in the hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian. Now, if evolution is true in those Precambrian rocks, we must find billions times billions of fossils of the evolutionary ancestors of these Cambrian animals. Billions of them should be there. Now, in those Precambrian rocks, we do find fossils of little microscopic bacteria and algae. And I think you will agree with me that if you can find fossils of little microscopic bacteria, you could certainly find fossils between those creatures and the Cambrian animals. And many of those Precambrian rocks are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. They ought to have billions times billions of fossils of clams, of snails, jellyfish, worms, sponges, and things like that. Ladies and gentlemen, nowhere on the face of this earth has anyone been able to find a fossil ancestor for a single one of those creatures. A clam has always been a clam, a snail has been a snail, a trilobite has been a trilobite, and a sponge has been a sponge. They just suddenly burst upon the scene. Richard Dawkins, British evolutionist, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, published in 1987, this evolutionist says this: the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years ago, are the oldest ones in which we find most of the invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appear, it is as though they were planted there without any evolutionary history. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that is the fact of the fossil record. It looks as if they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. They obviously, from the scientific evidence, they did not have any evolutionary history. And if they didn't, obviously they did not evolve. They were created. Tremendous, powerful, positive evidence for creation, this explosive appearance of these complicated creatures with no ancestors. Now, furthermore, evolutionists tell us one of these invertebrates evolved into a fish. Why? They'd say it took nearly 100 million years. We have billions times billions of fossils of the invertebrates. We have billions and billions and billions of fossil fishes. If an invertebrate evolved into the fish during 100 million years, we should have billions times billions of the intermediate forms. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have one, not even one. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed without a trace of an ancestor. Now, it is physically impossible to have 100 million years of evolution converting an invertebrate into a vertebrate without leaving a trace. That is powerful, positive evidence that these fishes were created. That's the evidence. Whether you believe it or not is something else you see. Now, any evolutionist, Dr. Hilpman or anyone else, must answer those questions. How can we have hundreds of millions of years of evolution producing that vast array of invertebrates without leaving any ancestors? How can we have evolution of an invertebrate into a fish and we can't even find one single transitional form? Those questions must be answered. But there is no answer. Simply no transitional forms, no ancestors. That shows that evolution is not taking place on this earth. Evolution is dead in the water. But there is much more. What about the origin of the universe? Well, we are told the universe began with a Big Bang billions of years ago. What did that Big Bang produce? Hydrogen gas and helium. And that's all. No carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, uranium, nickel, lead, or iron. Just hydrogen and helium, mainly hydrogen. And those gases expanded out through the universe. And from these gases, stars created themselves, galaxies created themselves, our solar system created itself, life evolved on this planet, and all the way to people. According to the theory of evolution, we have gone from hydrogen gas to people. Isn't that astounding? Then hydrogen, we could say, is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given enough time, becomes people. I don't know how anybody could believe such a thing, that our human brain, with 120 trillion connections, owes its ultimate origin to hydrogen gas. Well, if that's really true, then matter must have this intrinsic ability, this tendency to transform itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. That must be true. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't see that at all. There is no natural tendency for matter to do that. We have no natural law which describes any such property of matter. But we do have a natural law, the second law of thermodynamics, that tells us exactly the opposite is true. Our clothing wears out, our houses wear out, our machines wear out, molecules wear out, the entire universe is wearing out, going in the exact opposite direction required for evolution. As a matter of fact, the entire universe is wearing out because our sun and every other star in the entire universe is burning up its fuel. Now, if there is no God, or if God would not intervene, the day is coming inevitably when this universe is going to die, because every star in the universe will have burned up all of its fuel, and then the lights are going to go out. Not going to be any activity. There'll be no life anywhere in this entire universe. That is, if the universe follows its natural course. I'm convinced it won't, but if it does, that's the inevitable result. Now, my question for Dr. Hilpman and other evolutionists is this: if the natural laws and natural processes which now govern the universe are causing its inevitable death and destruction, and if, as evolutionists believe, these natural laws and natural processes are all there is and all there ever has been, how could they create the universe in the first place? Is it possible that the very same processes which are now destroying the universe could have been responsible for its origin? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach this an impossible conclusion? On the basis of the science of thermodynamics, we know this universe could not have created itself. It's impossible that it could start in a state of chaos and disorder and transform itself into the universe we have today. That violates the most well-tested natural law known in science. Now, furthermore, could life just have created itself? Why, if I'd asked 17 people to line up here in front of this auditorium and then keep scrambling around and lining up, 17 people could line up in more than 350 trillion different ways. 350 trillion, just 17 people. But the average protein molecule has 400 amino acids arranged in precise order. Why, if you could take those 400 amino acids, arrange them randomly, 1 trillion times a second for 5 billion years, there's not the remotest probability they'd line up in the way you'd want. And if it did happen, you'd have one single molecule of one single protein. It couldn't even happen once in 5 billion years. But if it did happen, you only have one molecule. But to get life started on this planet, you have to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of molecules, protein, DNA, and RNA. Just simply impossible. Sir Fred Hoyle, who got interested in this problem many years ago, very famous astronomer, an atheist at the time, assumed that every star in the entire universe had a planet like the Earth. The universe was 20 billion years old. He calculated the probability of life evolving on this anywhere in the universe, and it came out impossible. He said the probability of the evolutionary origin of life is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, if Dr. Hilpman or an evolutionist wants to believe that, that's their business. They shouldn't call it science and shouldn't teach it to their students. Ladies and gentlemen, on the basis of the fossil record, thermodynamics, probability, I say the only answer to our origin is in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Dr. Hilpman, the evolution position. You have 15 minutes. We'll wait for him to set the clock back. Here it goes, and you may begin.
Thank you. My position is not that I speak for a subset of society called evolutionists. There are no such organizations that I know of. And I would add that Dr. Gish does not speak for the Judeo-Christian theology realm either. We represent ourselves. And if indeed this debate is to serve its purpose, it is addressed to those of you, not necessarily all of you, but those of you who actually have not made up your mind. If you have made up your mind and you do not have an opening for any new ideas, then indeed I would be wasting my time, and so would Dr. Gish, addressing you. And so it is to that subset of the group here assembled and those of you watching on TV who are interested in learning that we meet tonight. And as a teacher, of course, that's my reason for being here. One of Dr. Gish's initial problems has to do with the origins. He indicated that indeed scientists have not observed origin, certainly not the origin of the universe, and for that matter we have not observed the origin of man. However, it is erroneous to think that evolution deals with origins. This is a typical ploy, often raised by groups that see evolution theory, and I say theory, not fact, as a challenge. Evolution deals with change of things that are here, not with origins. I leave that to theology. And most scientists who are practicing science do not deal with things for which they have no evidence. And so, as far as origins are concerned, that is not a field for science. Indeed, you can open a science book and find a Big Bang hypothesis discussed. Remember that science is practiced by Homo sapiens, and they are given at times to explore areas for which there is no evidence, but indeed it is purely conjecture. It must, however, be acknowledged as conjecture, not as fact. We haven't the foggiest idea about how the universe formed. The theory of the Big Bang is purely a simplistic extrapolation of an expanding universe in reverse, saying if it is expanding at this rate, if we reverse the process, bingo, that puts us back at such and such a point in time, and everything, all matter, is condensed at some initial point. This type of subjective logic is equal to what creationists often say about what is or is not possible in this universe. There are those who felt it was not possible for men to even survive going more than 40 miles an hour. until they did so. Scientists deal only with describing what we see, and to do so in a methodical pattern, not to do it randomly or, as much as possible, to do so free from personal bias. On the other hand, it has been presented, and will be implied even further, I'm sure, by Dr. Gish, that basically we are dealing with a yes-no choice. That is, either you are an evolutionist or you're a creationist. You have no mid-ground. That is an error. First of all, neither one of us has the power to impose that upon you. Our moderator has so indicated that he believes, strictly speaking, that the Bible and the Genesis section particularly should be taken verbatim. That is his prerogative. He's not imposing it on me or Dr. Gish. But in effect, that constraint does not exist. In matter of fact, there is a good body of evidence to suggest that the majority of the population in the United States, of which 60% roughly declare in census polls that they belong to some organized Christian or Christian and Judeo-Christian church, the majority of those people believe in some mid-ground. Fundamentalists represent a minority, represented by Dr. Gish, that take the position of the literal interpretation as the only acceptable position. Science doesn't deal with the origin, and that's all there is to it. It deals with how change occurs in the universe, and only where there is evidence to do so. If conjecture is introduced, then that should be acknowledged as such, or it is professionally unconscionable to merely extrapolate on the basis of a trend when you have no reason to believe that that trend has persisted either forward or backward in time. Again, science in part is a critical issue, and I think I will dedicate a good deal of the time that remains to making it clear in your minds what science is, because Dr. Gish will consistently quote men identified as evolutionists, as scientists, and usually will identify them as being doctor or having a PhD. This is leaning toward the concept of truth by authority, as if you should believe these people, simply because of title, position, or their vita. Where from the viewpoint of science, dogma or truth by authority, it doesn't cut it. It must be testable, it must be subject to criticism, it must be subject to examination. And that's why we have refereed journals for our publications, not publishing things within house, as it were, free of outside criticism. Let me also correct one thing Dr. Gish mentioned about evolution is taught in school as a fact. I cannot speak for all the teachers or all the texts, but I can tell you from the perspective of this scientist, I know of no competent scientist who thinks evolution is a fact. All scientific theory, and that's about as good as they get, moving up from hypotheses to be tested, all theory is tentative because the system demands that it be subject constantly to criticism, to correction, to review, refinement. That is the process from which scientific inquiry produces additional knowledge. I find it interesting that most of the contributions of scientific inquiry that produces knowledge in those broad areas we call the sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, earth sciences, whatever, that most of the information which serves our purpose, that finds by reading the fossils that have been so maligned here, to find the minerals the fuels and all the resources that we consume at a greater rate than any other nation in the world, that's okay. And the inferences and scientific knowledge that placed man on the moon or vehicles out to the edge of the solar system seems to be acceptable. But should someone interpret scientific knowledge to cross or come in conflict with strict interpretation of the Bible, suddenly this becomes a frivolous and unscientific activity. Sounds to me like there may be some subjective sorting, and I suggest for those of you who consider this with validity might think about it as it relates to why in certain areas we throw out the product of a process which has brought us truth in all other realms. It has been suggested that by Dr. Gish, who is a biochemist by training, that chance can't bring about such things as combinations of parts of protein or DNA or even so much as molecules. Well, let me suggest that anyone who has studied chemistry and physics will become readily aware that there is virtually no chance involved. In fact, the periodic table of chemistry is a magnificent example of non-chance, where our atoms of each element carry precisely the same characteristics, be they on the Earth, or what we have now recovered from the moon, and when we one day will begin to recover from other bodies within our solar system. Chance is not there. There is a law and order within nature, and that is what science is trying to find out. It is descriptive, it is not prescriptive. And it deals objectively. If it does not, or if an individual practitioner does not, he then removes himself for that particular moment from the scientific community. Whatever we produce must be subject to scrutiny. Witness the recent interest in cold fusion. And in a very short period of time, because of the rules of scientific inquiry, that you publish your hypotheses that survive your test to disprove it. And then that published hypothesis is looked at carefully, and replication is attempted by other workers in your field, and if it doesn't work, then you've got to refine it. And cold fusion died an early death by virtue of that very thing, even though it received a great deal of ballyhoo. The fossil record, as I say, was maligned only because it's apparent from his writings and from what he said tonight that Dr. Gish does not understand what fossils are. Fossils are accidents. A study of nature will show you whether you take a small or a large cycle, and following the first law, I'll get to the second shortly, the first law that matter is neither created or destroyed, we merely recycle it. I could quote the part of the Bible that deals with from dust to dust in the simple way that preservation of an organism is not the norm, it's the exception. And it is indeed a rare exception. Only in certain environments do we preserve things. The fossil record is so filled with gaps that it's surprising we even have any understanding. And note how I am criticizing the structure. I point to errors and mistakes and the need to correct. That's what science is all about. It is never final, for it is always subject to new information, and it must always be in accord with any valid evidence. It cannot be in accord with fictitious evidence or misinterpreted evidence. But the cumulative converging evidence supports, in terms of the societies that take advantage of it, science as something that is indeed valid and is not purely a trip, an ego trip for those who carry degree names in certain scientific fields. The second law is the last thing I'll address, and it's very simply, once again, although I know Dr. Gish knows this, the second law of things becoming more and more disordered only applies in a closed system, and if you want to change it, reverse it, you simply put energy in it. That's part of the definition, and that is precisely what Dr. Gish is purposely leaving out. Our Earth and everything that evolved is purely dependent upon the addition of energy from the sun. And when the sun quits, indeed, then entropy will follow. We are facing the same thing always at home, except that we found that by using fossil energy, we can overcome the second law temporarily. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hilpman. Right on time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, next will be the rebuttal stage of the debate, which will, each of the gentlemen will be given 5 minutes to rebut the other position. But before we do that, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more. We're live back in Kansas City with KC Online tonight. A creation evolution debate with Dr. Duane Gish from the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, California. And he's debating Dr. Paul Hilpman, who represents the evolution side from UMKC. And it's time for the rebuttal portion of the program. We'll have each of the debaters will have 5 minutes to rebut the other's comments. And Dr. Gish, you begin. Your time begins now.
Dr. Hilpman says that in the origin of life, chance is not involved at all. That is totally false. Now, when I in the laboratory as an organic chemist synthesized proteins, certainly I didn't leave anything to chance. But if these amino acids are just floating around in some hypothetical primitive ocean, the way they go together is purely chance, ladies and gentlemen. It'd be nothing but chance. There's no purpose there, no creator, no organic chemist, no natural selection. Before life had to be total chance. Absolutely, the origin of life would be total chance. And there is no chance that those things could have put themselves together to produce a biologically active molecule. Now, Dr. Hilpman says, I don't understand what fossils are. I've been studying these fossils for nearly 40 years. I was at the Smithsonian Institution Natural History Museum the other day. They said they had 40 million fossils in that museum alone. There's 250,000 different fossil species in our museum. We have billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of fossils. They're all over the place. What we don't have are the transitional forms. Now, if Dr. Hilpman is going to defend evolution, he must tell us how you're going to have 100 million years of evolution going from an invertebrate to a fish and not leave a trace. Not leave a trace. They don't have a trace of ancestors. That is not possible. He's going to have to explain how you can have this explosive appearance of all those complex invertebrates without leaving a trace, if evolution is true. You see, he must answer those questions, but there is no answer, not from an evolutionary point of view. He says the second law only applies to closed systems, and we creationists don't discuss that. If he read our literature, he knows that we discuss that very extensively. Now, in the evolutionary view, the universe is a closed system. It's an isolated system. Nobody did any work on it. Nobody brought anything from the outside. Everything that happened in the origin of the universe was a process of self-transformation. The second law of thermodynamics says such a system will never, ever become more complex, more organized, more ordered. Never. But it will inevitably decay and run down and become less organized, less complex, less ordered. And yet evolutionists believe that the universe began in the chaos and disorder of the Big Bang, this isolated system, closed system, and transformed itself into the universe we have today, including you. The second law of thermodynamics says that's impossible. It cannot happen and will never happen. Now, and Dr. Hilpman tells us that they don't teach evolution as a fact. You know, I've asked that question to many audience. I asked, now, how many of you students have been taught evolution? About all their hands will go up. And I say, now, how many of you students have been taught that evolution is a fact? Almost all the hands stay up. I have read scores and scores of books by evolutionists, and they tell us this. Now, you no longer must consider evolution as a theory. It's a fact. Dr. Hilpman says science does involve dogma. Let me tell you, there's one dogma in science, if there's any at all, and that's the theory of evolution. It is dogma. I mean, you can challenge the mechanism of evolution, you can challenge a particular phylogeny, but one thing you must never do is challenge the fact of evolution. If I had submitted a paper to one of the leading science journals defending the creationist position, it goes right in the wastebasket. They'll never publish it. It is dogma you cannot challenge. I agree. Science is what you see in this real world, what we see happening today. That's science. We can make testable scientific theory about things like that, but you can't make a testable scientific theory about evolution. What we do have, that fossil record, is absolutely contradictory to the theory of evolution. It is marvelously in accord with what we believe on the basis of creation. Now, Dr. Hilpman says there's no middle ground. Or he says, we say there's no middle ground. Well, there's only two possibilities that I'm aware of to explain our origin. A theistic, supernatural creation, or a non-theistic, mechanistic, naturalistic evolution. There's no middle ground. A theistic evolutionist, he is an evolutionist. He believes in evolution, you see. He may believe in God at the same time. A national poll said that 44% of American people believe in creation, just as really essentially taught in the Bible. About 36% believe in theistic evolution, and only about 9% believe in atheistic evolution. So at least about half of the people believe in creation as we believe it. So it is what most people believe, or more people believe. Now, he said also that evolution does not deal with origins. In our ICR library, our Institute for Creation Research Library, we have 100 books, probably on the origin of the universe, the evolution of the universe. We have scores of books on the evolution of life. That is origin. You see, it does involve those things.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gish. Dr. Hilpman, you have 5 minutes for your first rebuttal, and your time begins.
Where the second law of thermodynamics is concerned, I'm not going to eat up any time on that. If you even have an inkling that there seems to be a difference of opinion, read about it yourself. You'll find out whether indeed it is, as I have said, or Dr. Gish has said. In terms of the Cambrian explosion, and my terrible statement that Dr. Gish doesn't understand fossils, I don't mean he hasn't been exposed to fossils. They're fun to collect, and they're great to see. But to understand the fossil preservation, the chances of it occurring, why we have them and why we don't, is another matter that you don't learn simply by reading a book. But let me simply say this, that even when a fossil is preserved, that doesn't get you home at all. You have to also preserve the rocks in which those fossils exist. And all you have to do is look about you in the world today, and you can see rocks being eroded into topsoil and washed down. The process of erosion is a destructive one. It's part of the second law in practice. And indeed, we have so many gaps in the rocks, nowhere do we have a continuous depositional sequence, except at the bottom of the ocean and a relatively recent find since we have gotten into seafloor spreading and plate tectonics. And therein we have over 22 million years of continuous, uninterrupted fossil deposition, timed magnetic reversals that tie in with the land as well for age dating, and perhaps as significant as anything else, no gaps in the record. In that one basis alone, we could prove the age or antiquity of the earth beyond that which the literal interpretation would bring. But no matter how one looks at it, the fossil record is filled with gaps. And let me read something in the belief that there are many who can succinctly state something better than I can. This has to do with the way we operate. And again, I'm saying, I'm speaking as an individual. I don't know about evolution. As Dr. Gish has boggled me. I even heard you refer to atheistic evolution. I really wasn't aware there are so many types of evolution. I don't know which one, how you can tell which one I'm representing if we're all part of a group. But nonetheless, let me simply emphasize this point of scientific findings being provisional. The findings of science are provisional and subject to modification or revision as their scope becomes more comprehensive. The recognition that the findings of science are provisional and incomplete carries an ethical obligation to admit gaps in knowledge. Dr. Gish and his institute is extremely erudite. They spend their time reading scientific journals and taking particular note of when we admit we don't know or when we are forced to admit we are wrong. We live in that fishbowl, and yet it is offered in material which I guess I don't have. I left it down by my jacket, which was being disseminated on the campus the other night by creation scientist lieutenants, that says that science brainwashes people into believing in evolution. If brainwashing means to hang out your dirty laundry, subject everything to public criticism, to revision, to inspection, and even rejection, and that scientists dedicate their time, once establishing a hypothesis, to specifically try and prove it wrong, at no case, or in no case, accepting authority as the basis of truth, I don't see how you can call that a science and then creation based on accepting dogmatically a literal interpretation as being part of the same science. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hilpman. Now each speaker will have a second rebuttal period of 5 minutes, and Dr. Gish will begin. And your time begins now, Dr. Gish.
Dr. Hilpman pointed out that we creationists read scientific literature. I certainly confess to that. We read it very, very carefully. And when I quote from the scientific literature, I always quote from the evolutionists. I quote what they say about the facts. Now, they may differ from our interpretation, but they have stated the facts. And if I quote creationists, nobody would, you say, they just say, oh, that's a bunch of creationists. I quote evolutionists. I quote again James W. Valentine from his book, Evolution of Complex Animals, or the chapter, The Evolution of Complex Animals, in the book, What Darwin Began, published in 1985. Let me quote what an evolutionist says. The fossil record is of little use in providing direct evidence of the pathways of descent of the phyla or of invertebrate classes. Each phylum with a fossil record had already evolved its characteristic body plan when it first appeared, so far as we can tell from the fossil remains, and no phylum is connected to any other via intermediate fossil types. Indeed, none of the invertebrate classes can be connected with another class by a series of intermediates. End of quote. That is what the fossil record shows. Discontinuity, not continuity. You can't have these things separate. They've got to be connected by evolutionary connecting forms, and there are none. Now, that is the fact, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Hilpman has not even tried to address that question, you see. Now, to say, oh, well, not all animals form fossils, of course not. Yes, and some fossil-bearing rocks are eroded away. That's right. But we have billions and billions and billions of fossils, ladies and gentlemen, all kinds of fossils. If evolution has been going on for hundreds of millions of years of time, we should have carloads of these transitional forms. But we don't have those transitional forms. As these scientists themselves say, these evolutionists say, you see, it's not a matter of what is preserved and what is not preserved. What is there among what is preserved, you see. No transitional forms are found among those that are preserved. Now, he says scientific findings are provisional. Ordinary and good science, yes, that's true, but not in evolution theory, ladies and gentlemen. Evolution is taught as a fact. He said they don't brainwash students. I don't know what you call it, when the only thing taught in our colleges and universities is evolution theory, and they will not teach the scientific evidence that supports creation. They won't let their students hear it. If that isn't brainwashing, I don't know what is. Well, he says that no use discussing the second law of thermodynamics any further. Ladies and gentlemen, the second law of thermodynamics applies to all systems, open or closed. I mean, we are open systems, aren't we? We can take in food. We can take in plenty of food. And we're the most complex machines in the universe. But what happens to us? We can't beat the second law of thermodynamics, can we? We die. Go to a pile of dust. But we know that the universe itself is an isolated system. There's no question that the second law of thermodynamics would apply to the origin of the universe. The universe could not have created itself. If science is science, if scientific laws are scientific laws, and the second law of thermodynamics is the most well-tested law known in science, this universe could not have created itself naturally. And if it could not have created itself naturally, it had to be created supernaturally. That's what Sir Fred Hoyle said about the origin of the universe. He says his calculations have shown that life could not have evolved anywhere in this universe. And if it could not have evolved naturally, it had to be created supernaturally. Therefore, he said there must be a God, a man who'd been an atheist almost all of his life. Yes, we can know these things, ladies and gentlemen. And the scientific evidence. Again, I challenge Dr. Hilpman to explain how every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed without a trace of an ancestor. All of those invertebrates, they all appear without a trace of an ancestor. That is not the evidence we must find on the basis of evolution theory. It is absolutely not only contradictory, it is incompatible with the theory of evolution. The only answer that we can give is, see, these things were created. In fact, as one of the evolutionists said, there's only two possibilities. He said either animals arose from some pre-existing form by an evolutionary process, or they appeared fully formed. And if they did appear fully formed, then they must have been created by some pre-existing supernatural, omnipotent creator. Well, they do appear fully formed. And I therefore say they had to be created. The evidence is absolutely solidly in favor of spatial creation.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Dr. Hilpman, your second rebuttal. You have 5 minutes beginning now.
I guess one of the reasons that Dr. Gish has trouble with the fossils, the numbers that we have, I guess the billion seem like a lot, but of course when you think that the Earth is only a few thousand years old, that's a big number. When you consider that the Earth is over 4.5 billion years old, you can have 4.5 creatures, one a year, and you're going to end up with all sorts of numbers. The long and short of it is, the fossils that have been preserved and collected are but a fraction, 1/10 of 1% of the organisms that lived at the particular time. There's an interesting article that argues that only the stupid forms get preserved and the smart ones escape that kind of entrapment. As for the Cambrian explosion, I didn't want to get into it because we cover that in introductory courses and in high school, and I think it's very clear, and Dr. Gish knows the answer, is that most fossils, and I'm not talking 51%, but most fossils are preserved because they have hard parts. And in the evolutionary sequence, hard parts came later. And it is only when there were skeletons to be preserved, or a carapace of chitin, or something to that effect, do you get much preservation. Well, we do have imprints of jellyfish, and as a matter of fact, before the Cambrian that Dr. Gish talked about, we have fossils fully formed. But there happens to be a large gap in time, and rocks that are deformed and metamorphosed, that is, that they are subject to great heat and pressure, all fossils contained therein are destroyed. If one is really interested in this question, don't take truth by authority of either one of us. Simply go and read with an open mind. to seek something about how the earth works, there's very little in the Bible. Indeed, in Ecclesiastes, the hydrologic cycle is well outlined to explain the cyclical nature of water. But where the Bible discusses nature, it discusses it as a cyclic thing. Where the lack of fossils transitional are concerned, that's partially because we have a totally inadequate representation of all the life that was there. But to suggest that everything was formed, well, Stephen Gould of Harvard recently, and I mention him not because I want to be a name dropper, but it's one that Dr. Gish, a gentleman that Dr. Gish mentions also, because Dr. Gould is quite ready to admit, as I am, that we have lots of gaps. In certain areas, we don't have any knowledge at all. And it doesn't bother us, nor does it threaten us or make us insecure, because we're merely describing. We don't have a purpose to prove or disprove anything. We merely wish to get at the truth. But Dr. Gould said, if this is true, what Dr. Gish says, then I'd like him to show me a cow next to a dinosaur, or even a fossil of anything we find today back in the Cambrian, excepting those forms such as lingula, a clam that lives deep in the mud and hasn't changed for nearly 300 million years. It's not subject to change. There's no selectivity, no survival problem. I've got about a minute left, and I'd like to just end on an observation of where I take the position that science is being taught because it is not pushing a religion or a religious perspective. Attempts to do so have indeed met with judgments by the court. But we don't all agree with the courts, so I'll not mention that so much. But I thought it interesting 2 weeks ago that the Catholic Church has decided that Copernicus was right after all, and they shouldn't put the nasty fella to sleep. That indeed the Earth is not the center of our solar system, and that the Earth moves around the sun rather than the way that the Church believed and for which they put him to death. Science doesn't have a mission. It is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. It will continue to do so, and it is something to be taught in schools, but in a place where separation of state and church is the rule, I'm afraid creation science doesn't cut it.
Thank you, Dr. Hilpman. That concludes the rebuttal portion of tonight's debate. When we return, we'll take questions from our studio audience live with lots more of KC Online Evolution Creation Debate. Stay tuned. Welcome back to a special KC Online Evolution versus Creation debate. Our distinguished debaters are Dr. Duane Gish from the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, California, and Dr. Paul Hilpman from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. This final portion of our debate is where our studio audience participates by asking our scientists the questions. The debaters are restricted to 2 minutes for their answers, and the other debater can respond following with a maximum of 2 minutes for his rebuttal as well. So we begin with this side down here, gentlemen. Please state your name, where you're from, and your question for whoever.
My name is Roger Keith. I'm a student at UMKC, and my question is for Dr. Hilpman. Dr. Hilpman, do you have any positive evidences for evolution? Do you believe in transitionary forms? If so, could you give some as an example?
Yeah, probably the best one and one that you could reference has been the deep sea drilling that's gone on to expose the relationships of the seafloor spreading and continental drift, where I said you have 22 million years of uninterrupted deposition and specific faunal types. Foraminifera, it's a one-celled, like an amoeba in a shell, is the fossil used to separate the layers in ages, and there are no breaks. There's continuous evolution of the forms, and they're short-lived, the ones that have been chosen. There are others that are long-lived and not used, but nonetheless, It's very clearly written up, and if you want to see me afterward, I can refer you to a particular publication that shows that. And that's a case where we don't have to resort on gaps or anything else. Everything is there, all the fossils, quite clear. Also, they tell me in viruses, but that's more in Dr. Gish's area, but particularly, say, the AIDS virus, almost changes and evolves before we can really attack it. But that's not my area, so I'm not offering that as an evidence. I refer to the seafloor.
Okay, Dr. Hilpman. Dr. Gish, your response to that?
I'm rather surprised at Dr. Hilpman's answer. He said they had that long time of uninterrupted deposition. He was just explaining earlier why we didn't find these transition forms, because there were all those interruptions and all those things that wrote it away. Now he says there's a long period of steady deposition. Well, when there is such periods, only minor changes take place. You might have a fluctuation in the size and shapes of, say, the shells of a mollusk of some kind, a clam or something like that. Those are minor variations fitting well within the creation's interpretation. Is how do we account for the origin of clams, snails, brachiopods, and things like that, not the minor variations you see. Of course, C4 splitting is no evidence for evolution at all. Most evolutions accept it, some reject it. Some creations accept it, some creations reject it. So it has nothing to do with origins, you see, not C4 spreading. Fact is, some recent evidence published in Science magazine, where they actually took cores from the bottom of the ocean, was very, very contradictory to C4 splitting and so forth. So it's still a very open and controversial question, but it has nothing to do with origins. But where you have these series, they're just minor variations. That's not evolution, you see. That doesn't explain where lilies and llamas and tigers and people came from. Minor variations.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen,
You
state your
have a
name.
question for me now.
My name is Jeff Bennett. I go to Calvary Bible College in Kansas City. My question is to you, Dr. Hilpman. A lot of what's being discussed here, as you stated, is very subjective. To many of us, it's pragmatic as well. And I wanted to try to boil this down as much as I possibly could to something that we could grab a hold of, whether we do or do not believe in evolution. My question is, if evolution is true and there is no God, then everything is fine and well with everyone because we die and rot. But if there is a creator and he did create everything, then when we die, we have to report back to him. Are you willing to put your eternity on the line for the fact that there may not be a God and evolution is true? Are you willing to do that?
It's very difficult to answer that question, largely because you make a fallacious assumption that if evolution is true, remembering now it is not final, it is a theory that we are improving, that if it is true, then there is no God. I fail to see where there's any reason or basis of coming to that conclusion. Now, if we are going to say that if evolution is true, then fundamentalists are wrong, I think that's true. But fundamentalists represent a minority of the Judeo-Christian population. Now, this is not based on numbers anyway, so that doesn't make it right. Lots of people can be wrong. Most people can be wrong. But we don't have a mission in science to prove or disprove any theological position. That's up to you to handle it. But fundamentally, indeed, if evolution is true as we now see it, and it's improving, we hope, then indeed creation scientists' strict interpretation of Genesis is wrong. But I indicated, and Dr. Gish just doesn't seem to want to respond to this, is that science does not address origins. He keeps returning to that because that's the area that the greatest opportunity for conflict lies. We're not into it. We're into the changes that occur in things that are here.
Okay, Dr. Gish.
Well, if evolution doesn't address origins, why do all these high school and college biology books have chapters on the origin of life? Look, check them. They all do. And certainly the kids in the schools are taught the theory of the Big Bang Theory, which is the origin of the universe. They're certainly taught that. Now, I would agree. You can be a Christian and believe in evolution. You can. I think it's totally wrong. You can't believe the Bible and believe in evolution, but you can be a Christian and believe in evolution. But the leaders in evolution certainly are unbelievers. Many of them are atheists, but not all evolutionists are atheists. I want to make that very clear. But the theory of evolution itself is a non-theistic theory. It doesn't need God. It excludes God. The very definition of evolution excludes God. It's a process of self-transformation, you see. God is not necessary. Now, you teach that to students, and they sit there, we start out as nothing but hydrogen gas, and we come to people by a natural process who needs God. So they soon decide there is no God. I am responsible only to myself. That's why we're very much concerned about this question of origins today. We know that there's tremendous evidence that there is a creator, and if there is a creator, he's the Lord and master of this universe, and there's a relationship between the created and the creator.
Okay, thank you. Sir, your question.
Hi, my name is Mark Robinson. Dr. Hilpman, how do you think the Grand Canyon was formed?
By erosion.
What agency was the agency of erosion, Dr. Hilpman?
For the most part, we can't rule out some mechanical decomposition and breakdown because of temperature changes. But most of it is simply aqueous or fluvial erosion.
By the Colorado River?
That happens to be the name we apply to the water that's there, but the waters doing this came long before man was here to give him a name.
Well, let me say this. Any geologist who's familiar with the geology of the Grand Canyon no longer believes that the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon, because they believe that that Kaibab Plateau, you know, the south rim is about 7,500 feet high, the north rim is about 8,500 feet high. It is unlifted tremendously. They believe that that occurred, they say, 65 million years ago. Now they're dating the very beginning of the Colorado River only around 5 million years ago. So they believe that area was uplifted 65 million years ago. The Colorado River came along 60 million years ago. Would it run up over there and go down the other side and cut a canyon? I should say not. It just run around it. So they know the Colorado River did not cut the Grand Canyon. They don't have really a theory on how the Grand Canyon formed. I would agree with Dr. Hilpman. It formed by erosion, but not by some little river. There had to be a tremendous amount of water that came down through there. The Havasupai Indians, who live in one of the branches of the Colorado River, of the Grand Canyon, said that the Grand Canyon formed by a vast worldwide flood. I think they may be much closer to the truth than those geologists. It was tremendous erosion that cut that Grand Canyon when the material was loosely consolidated.
Okay, thank you. Your question, sir?
I'm Robert Key, and I'm again from Calvary Bible College. Now, I'm studying to be a pastor, and you're a scientist. So we're coming at this at two different angles. You stated that the big gaps are in the fossil record. The fossil record being the history. You stated that there were big gaps in the fossil record. You also stated that the fossil record is totally inadequate to record the process, or the processes I'm putting in. You said the record of human life, or the process, as I understand.
No, I didn't say of human life.
You did say, you just said of life?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, of life. So if we do have these holes punched in the record and you don't have the evidence, what is the difference between trusting evolution? What is the difference between this lack of evidence and my faith in my God? What's the difference between this and faith?
Oh, I cannot speak with authority about your faith in your God, but I can say this much, is that the gaps in the fossil record are largely a function of the lack of preservation, either because of the environment they lived in or they didn't have the parts to be preserved. And then it's compounded by the gap in the stratigraphy, the rock layers that are destroyed. So there are several reasons for this. But to the extent that we can interpret this, in other words, I think it's amazing that we have any, so it's almost like Wheel of Fortune. They put up one word or one letter that appears 3 or 4 places, and someone comes up with the right answer. Well, it's the difference between Wheel of Fortune and science is that we test it out. It's constantly subject to scrutiny and criticism. The gospel, as according to Dr. Gish, is not. That's the difference.
Let me say this. Now, Dr. Hilpman may tell an audience like this, that the lack of transition forms is due to the poverty of the fossil record. If he tried to publish that in a standard geological journal today, it probably would be rejected because most geologists know that could not possibly be true. David Rauch, professor, University of Chicago, an evolutionist, he says that is not valid. We have 250,000 different species in our museum. We have hundreds of millions of fossils in those museums. We have plenty of fossils from every so-called geological period. There's no gaps where there's total lack of fossils, nothing like that anywhere in the world. T.N. George, a number of years ago, said we could no longer appeal to the poverty of the fossil record. We have tons and tons and tons of fossils, ladies and gentlemen. We have plenty of fossils. What we don't have are those transitional forms. Now, wouldn't it be absolutely remarkable? You have hundreds of millions of years, billions of years, and it is always the transitional forms that somehow get washed away, and all the terminal forms just remain. That would be incredible, now wouldn't it? No. You see what Dr. Hilpman is trying to explain, why we don't have transitional forms, why we don't have the evidence that his theory demands. We don't have to make excuses. The evidence that we have remarkably supports creation.
Okay. Your question, ma'am?
My name is Allison Smith. I'm here from Kansas City, and I just have a question for Dr. Gish. It's good to understand where we come from, but I'd like to know from a creation standpoint what is going to happen to man, the end result of our life. What is going to happen to man?
If we had to depend totally on human knowledge, we wouldn't have the foggiest notion. Fact is, evolutionists don't know. They don't know whether the camel's going to go from 2 humps to 1 hump or 3 humps. They have no way of predicting what's going to happen in the future. By evolution makes no prediction. A creationist, if I was going to predict, I'd have to go as a Christian by what the Bible says, by what the Bible says. And I tell you, it says things are not going to get any better, but it says God is going to intervene. Now, we didn't come here to discuss and debate theology. So that's all I want to say. But if I'm going to decide what I think is going to happen to the human race, I have to look to the Bible for the answer, because it has to be revealed. We don't know naturally. I would say one thing, it's pretty dim future. If we're going to depend on the human efforts, things are getting terrible and worse and worse and worse. And that's what the Bible says is going to happen in the last days. So I'd have to go by what the Bible says in answering that kind of a question.
As far as the future of Homo sapiens is concerned, that again is outside the realm of geologists, not so much because we can't predict. As a matter of fact, one test of a scientific theory is, does it provide us with the basis of prediction? The efficacy of scientific knowledge is what has made possible all the benefits we have. We can anticipate, even though it's crude, we have gradually increased our understanding of the weather to where the predictions are pretty good. We're close to predicting earthquakes, volcanoes, things of that sort. Science isn't doing too badly, but Homo sapiens' future lies outside the realm of natural selection. We have opted ourselves out of that. We have also entered into the realm of genetic engineering, so the attempts to apply predictive knowledge as to what Homo sapiens will do would be a foolhardy activity for a person from Dr. Gish's position or from mine. We can take whatever position we wish, but it's not really germane to the evolutionary or scientific approach to prediction.
My name is Ken Coleis, and I am too from Calvary Bible College, and I wanted to address my question to Dr. Hilpman. It has to do with radiometric age dating.
Yes.
The number that you gave for the age of the universe before was 4.5 billion years old?
No, I didn't. I talked about the age
of the Earth.
Yes.
Okay, my fault. This is an area that interests me very much, and I've done some reading on it. And with the different rubidium, strontium, potassium, argon, lead, uranium, and all the different dating methods, I read one of the dates that they came up with for a lava field in Hawaii. They dated it with one of those methods, and they said it was 200 million years old, and yet this was a lava field that was seen by humans, and it was only a couple hundred years old. And with that and other things, I was wondering how you could base, as far as I know, the 4.5 billion year old is based on one of those radiometric age dates, and I was just curious with all those things how you could come up with that number.
Do you have another example of an error like that? Did you get that from one of Dr. Gish's books?
No, I
Step
oh,
to
good.
the microphone.
The reason I brought that up was the fact that, indeed, the readings are made by individual humans, and mistakes are made. Say, we're not hiding anything. We're obligated to bring this out. Anyone can publish. As a matter of fact, if you were to go downtown to one of these unquestionable houses that sells books on various things, there are lots of publications in a pawn shop. That doesn't mean that it's right. And there are lots of publications that have erroneous data in it. Most referee journals subject these to secondary criticism. Lots of mistakes are made in age dating. We're improving our equipment. It's finer. We're able to count better and measure small particles better, which is one of the problems in most age dating. They're best approximations now. They'll be better in 10 years. That one particular example you're referring to, I'm not familiar with it because I don't keep a listing of all the goose, but we make lots of goo. But it didn't stand up under scrutiny. It's not in concert with the rest of the evidence. The same kind of process.
Let me say, first of all, creationists take both viewpoints on the age. Some believe the Earth could be billions of years old. Others take the view that the evidence indicates that things are much, much younger than billions of years. Those of us on our institute staff, we have 9 scientists. 8 have their doctorates in various major areas of science. We believe very strongly that there's much evidence to indicate that things are much, much younger than millions or billions of years. But creationists take both points of view. Now, about the efficacy of these radiometric dating methods, we have some very, very serious reservations. As a young man mentioned, there's an article published in Science which recorded the fact. Rocks only 200 years old gave ages of 20 million, 160 million, and perhaps several billion years, known to be very young. Dr. Austin of our institute, one of our geologists, taking rock from the Grand Canyon. Down at the bottom should be more than 1 billion years. Sure enough, he sent it to a radiometric dating lab. They gave 1.2 billion years, I think. But he took a rock at the top of the Grand Canyon. It's got to be younger than the canyon. Nobody would believe that canyon is more than a few million years old. It gave an age of 1.34 billion years. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to take many rocks. We're going to see what these people get. Are their methods working or not, you see? And when we do that, we'll know whether these methods work. We have a very strong suspicion that they don't. But regardless, Hoyle said the universe is 20 billion years old. But his calculation showed even in 20 billion years, you couldn't get life. You couldn't even get one single molecule of a large molecule like a protein or DNA in 20 billion years. No way you're going to get life by any evolutionary process, even in 20 billion years.
Okay, we're running very short on time. Ma'am, your question, please.
My name is Katie Coffin. I'm a journalist, and last spring I was taught evolution as a fact at a local university. I've been closely associated with the scientific community for about 11 years, and I understand about a lot of studies that are done by professors. They do publications, and from one to another, they don't want to contradict their own work. Are either of you aware of such studies and falsification of scientific data for publication purposes because the experiments can't be duplicated?
Could you repeat?
She was saying that some journalists, or some scientists, falsify their work, basically, and they don't want to. Go ahead and state it again quickly.
They don't want to contradict their own previous work, so it doesn't seem to be a foolproof thing. Science doesn't seem to be a pure.
So they don't want to contradict their own work. Does anyone want to address it?
Of course, it had been proven there had been frauds in science. A number of those cases have been proven. And we don't accuse evolutionists of being deliberately fraudulent. Sometimes they have been, but not usually they are not. But if you don't believe in evolution, if you don't support evolution, you can't get your papers published. Even worse than that, Hannes Alfvén, professor at the University of California in San Diego, a Nobel Prize winner in physics. He doesn't go along with the current Big Bang cosmology. He can't get his papers published. A Nobel Prize winner and an evolutionist. He can't get his papers published. Why? Because he doesn't go along with current dogma. I asked one of the editors of Discover magazine a few years ago. I said, if I submitted an article to you supporting creation, would you publish it? She said, no, we won't. So then they turn around and say, see, you guys don't publish in our journals. No wonder we don't publish in their journals. Dr. A.E. Weiler Smith had 3 earned doctorates from European universities. He gave a lecture at Oxford University. He said, I offered that manuscript to 4 leading science journals, and not a one of them would publish it. Talk about dogma. Talk about discrimination. Talk about brainwashing. That's where it is in the field of science today.
How much time you got left?
But you've got about a minute,
Okay.
minute and a half.
Indeed, there are that sort of thing, because what we're talking about, scientists or creationists, if there are such people in that category, are humans. I wouldn't worry about that too much. Use your own head. I don't consider Messrs. Baker and Swaggart reflective of the clergy of this world. They exist. We have things that happen. But where it comes to the question of what science does or otherwise, we're not out, in a sense, to do anything other than to describe the nature of the world. Each of you wrestles with things in a scientific manner, one way or another, to solve your own problems. And that's fine. It's not really a matter of dealing with origins or God. Science merely discovers ways to describe. Perhaps you would be happy to hear me say the works of God.
Okay, that concludes tonight's debate. I hope each of us can say we are better informed as a result of this program. A special thanks to each of our debaters, Dr. Duane Gish from the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, California.
Great talking to you again.
And Dr. Paul Hilpman from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And a special thanks to the audience, our live audience here at Kansas City Youth-For-Christ Auditorium. Give yourselves a hand. And a special thanks to all of you at home, all of our KC Online regular viewers, and hopefully some we've picked up tonight. Join us again next week. We'll see you then. So.